Hi, it's Claire and welcome to Needle Say More. Today I'm going to show you how to create a bound seam in 2 minutes. So for this you're going to need 2 pieces of fabric and some bias binding. It helps if it's a contrast fabric. So you're going to start by sewing your 2 pieces of fabric together on a 1.5cm seam allowance and pressing open. You also want to press your bias binding in half lengthwise to give it a nice crisp fold. You're then going to pin your bias binding onto your seam allowance, right side spacing, so that you're lining all the raw edges up together. And you're going to do this on both sides of the seam allowance and pin it in place. And then you're going to sew just down the seam allowance, making sure you don't catch the fabric on either side of the seam allowance. And you want to be sewing in the groove of that bias binding. Once the bias binding is secure on both sides, you're going to go ahead and fold it using the fold line that we created when we ironed it. You're going to pin it into place, and then we want to top stitch that bias binding in place so it completely covers and conceals the raw edge of the seam allowance. So it's a bound seam, we're binding it basically. It's really important when you get to the stage that you just go through the seam allowance. You don't go through all layers because you shouldn't have the stitching going through onto the other side of the fabric. So you're going to carefully top stitch down either side of the seam allowance, taking your time so that you catch it on both sides. Once you top stitch one of the seam allowances into place, you're going to go ahead and repeat on the opposite side. So remember, you're just sewing through the bias binding and the seam allowance, not through the main piece of fabric. Reverse stitch at the top and bottom, and then sew all the way to the end. Trim off any loose threads, and there you have it. So you should have both seam allowances bound in the bias binding, a really, really neat and professional finish. And then on the outer side of the fabric, which will be your garment, you shouldn't see any of the lines of stitching. They should all just be through those seam allowance lines.